Story 1. This is the opposite route here, but I found it amusing. My boss was out of town and I managed a tea shop near a Starbucks years ago. This kid came in, a foreigner, and said he was supposed to start today. We were hiring and I trained him. My boss came back 2 days later and had no idea. The kid was in the wrong place, but he stayed with us. Hired on the spot without even applying. Story 2. New guy drove a forklift into a fire hydrant in front of a safety representative for the company. His supervisor was called over, and he immediately tells the supervisor that he won't pass a drug test, as he used his only bottle of clean urine earlier that day when he was hired. Everybody standing there immediately burst into laughter, which continued as security, also laughing, escorted him off-site. Even the supervisor was all smiles, just gave him a pat on the back and wished him the best of luck. It was wild. Story 3. A week. I worked in a bar and a new girl started. At work, she seemed a little rough but was fine. One day, she finished a shift, sat at the bar, and ordered a red wine with lemonade and ice in it. Her boyfriend came in, they had a huge argument in front of my manager and several customers, and she threw her drink over her boyfriend and dramatically stormed out. Story 4. I heard this from a manager I worked with when I was in fast food. There was this one kid who didn't show up for work. He often skipped work, so the manager called around but couldn't get anyone to fill in his shift, so she had to cover it for him. A few hours into his shift, the guy who skipped work shows up with his friends and orders food from that manager. She fired him on the spot. Edit. These were my first awards, and you all just multiplied my karma by 10. Thanks, everyone, for the likes and awards. Story 5. First day of work, he walks in and says, "What is up, dumbass?" to the guy that parked next to, but didn't touch, his new Camaro he bought since he got hired. The guy was the chief executive officer of the company I used to work for, on a visit to our branch. Literally 10 minutes into his shift, he was signing release papers. Story 6. We had a recent college graduate who would use his corporate card for personal purchases. He figured that the company would just keep deducting from his payroll until it was paid off. He was fired after 3 months of constant reminders to stop doing it. I don't think it qualifies as the fastest because he lasted 3 months, but it was so idiotic. Story 7. I work in construction. We had 2 new hires who were friends starting on the same day. The boss told one to take a coffee order and come back. He took everyone's money and said he needed his friend to go with him because it was a big order. They never came back. Story 8. This was a while ago at my old job. A new guy was hired as a busboy. He was super annoying and tried to insert himself into everyone's conversation whether they wanted him there or not. It only took a couple of hours for the whole restaurant to dislike him. I was working the bar and he kept eating the bar fruit. I personally didn't care, but the manager did. The manager came over and told him to stop eating the fruit. He looked the manager in the eye and ate another piece of fruit. The manager said, "Really?" followed by, "Come with me to the office." The new guy promptly replied with, "All right, man, calm down. I can tell you got that big energy for a good reason," followed by a cliché wink and an elbow nudge in front of me and for other employees. I wanted to slam my face into the ice bin. It was so cringeworthy to witness. He promptly walked out the front door 10 minutes later without his uniform on anymore. The worst thing about it was the manager was an insanely laid-back guy. The whole restaurant was insanely laid-back. You really had to try hard to get fired from this place. Had he not thrown in that big line, I'm almost positive he would have just gotten a slap on the wrist and kept the job. Story 9. Not sure if it counts as being fired, but a guy in our basic training threatened a drill sergeant with a bayonet. No idea what happened after he went to the hospital, but I did not see him again. Story 10. Worked in a grocery store for a while. A new guy took a lobster out of the tank and removed the elastic bands on its claws, then proceeded to put it back in the tank. The thing killed all the other lobsters in the tank. Story 11. I got hired as a long-term temporary employee with one other person to do some basic data entry work at a major brand pretty much everyone has heard of. It was at their corporate headquarters, so it was quite prestigious. Anyway, we went through all of this onboarding process in the morning that required us to get photo identification and figure out parking and all that stuff. Then, after 2 or 3 hours, we were introduced to one of the employees in our new department who began going over what we were going to be doing. None of it seemed overly difficult, and I figured that while it was a new system I had never used before, I would be able to work it out in a few days as long as I asked questions and took notes. And that was the thing that made me realize that the other person who got hired with me probably lied on her resume and was completely out of her depth. She didn't take any notes and didn't ask any questions. And whenever I glanced at her, I could see flashes of panic on her face. Well, lunchtime came, and when we came back, she said that another company had called her and offered her a permanent position, and she couldn't work with us any longer. Both the person training us and I knew what was going on, but I'll give the other lady credit for finding a way out without losing face too badly. The takeaway here is, yes, fake it until you make it can and does work. But you need to be able to fake it. You can't fake faking it. Story 12. A 19-year-old kid got hired to work the seafood counter. Saw him twice and then never again. Asked a coworker what happened. He had closed seafood one night and was walking out of the store, and the 5 pounds of crab legs he'd stuffed down the back of his pants fell out in front of the closing manager. Edit. It was at a Publix. No, it was not Jameis Winston. Story 13. New guy started on Monday and was gone by Friday. The guy hit some racking in the warehouse with the forklift. The boss saw him do it, and the guy decided to lie about it when asked if he knew what happened. Story 14. This was a pizza place where I worked in college. A new guy started on Thursday. He was a fine worker and we showed him the ropes. He was on sandwiches, which is the easiest job. The instructions are right in front of you. On Friday, he didn't call or show up. It's Friday, the busiest night of the week, and he and I were the only kitchen workers who weren't also drivers. On Monday, a police officer showed up at the restaurant looking for him. I had no idea what happened, as he wasn't there. On Tuesday, the owner informed me he was let go. Story 15. The information technology crew at a large government office worked on a ticket system, meaning that the government workers submitted their problems online, and one of the IT guys would pick it up on their end. The new guy just started his first day, logged into a computer at an empty office, and submitted a reinstall entire operating system request so he could spend all day there. The manager decided to check in on him before lunch to see how he was doing, and he was completely asleep. Fired before they even finished his hiring paperwork. Story 16. Spent my summers in college working as a laborer for a construction company. Anyway, we were doing a bunch of renovation in an active hospital, so noise and dust were a huge concern. We were a small crew and just starting renovations on an area with a super tight schedule, so the company hired a subcontractor for some of the work. Enter these two clowns who show up to do some demolition work. The foreman gives them the talk about how they may be used to doing things a certain way, but this is an active hospital, so he'd rather the work take longer than for them to make a huge mess or a lot of noise. An hour later, we apparently got multiple complaints about the noise and the mess, so the foreman calls me up and says to go over there and clean up now, and that he'd be by shortly to see what was going on. These dudes had dust and broken wall everywhere. I could hear them halfway down the hall, just smashing away without a care in the world. The foreman shows up and we walk into the room to witness this dude standing on a pile of rubble, swinging a sledgehammer over his head at a brick wall that he's removed the bottom from. Somehow the rest of this wall is still hanging from the ceiling. I have no idea how. The guy wasn't even wearing a hard hat, apparently oblivious that at any moment that wall might give way and crush him. The foreman lost his mind on these guys. He kicked them out immediately and got on the phone with their company and told them he didn't want to see these guys on site again. Lots of choice words were used, and he even threatened to fire the subcontractor entirely and get someone else to do the work. Story 17, guy got hired, went through training and all that. On his first day on the floor, he disappeared for 3 hours and then came back high on meth or something like that. A manager found him in the bathroom aisle, staring at himself in the mirror. The manager looked at the cameras after firing him, and the guy was there staring at himself for at least 30 minutes. Edit to clear up some questions. I worked at Home Depot. He was in the aisle where we sell bathroom countertops and medicine cabinets. We also have mirrors in this aisle, and that's where he was not in the bathroom. Haha. Story 18. A coworker quit his job, a great job with great pay and great benefits, to work in a radio repair place. I mean, you have to do what you love, and he was also a big radio enthusiast. He got fired on the first day for stealing parts for his own radios at home. Took him over a year to get back with us. I was surprised they rehired him. He then got fired for being a security risk about a year or so later. Story 19. Where to begin? One person didn't show up for their second day, citing culture shock, and then spent at least an hour each day complaining about everything to human resources. They were gone within a month. Another person refused to follow processes and called his manager an irrelevant woman in team meetings. Gone within a week. My favorite was technically a new coworker from my perspective only, as I just become aware of their existence. They interpreted we're going to retire that server from production, as we're going to throw the hardware off the roof into a skip, and proceeded to head down to the data center, power the thing off in the middle of the day, drive to his friend's office, plug the box in, and deploy a bunch of interactive voice response scripts he derived from our proprietary scripts so they could run a bunch of psychic and sex hotlines. He was gone within 10 minutes of getting that server back. Story 20. New server, aged mid-30s. On the third day he was working, we had to fire him mid-shift. Why? He went into the public restrooms with other guests clearly in there using the urinal and started doing lines of cocaine off the edge of the sink. Story 21. I called a temporary agency to get someone to help me count inventory. They sent a guy over with a cast on his arm. That was my first what on earth. But I went with it because we were just counting parts. Then I came back from lunch, and this guy was in my office chair, zoned out and drooling on himself with a can of air duster in his lap. I woke him up and escorted him out of my warehouse. Never used that temporary agency again. Story 22. New director starts at lunchtime, goes to the cafeteria, pays for the first salad plate by weight, then goes back twice for refills without paying. The cafeteria has cameras, and the cafeteria manager talks to the partner in charge. New director fired before the end of the day. Story 23. Guy had been working a few days at a barn. He decided to smoke right by bales of hay. The manager saw him and fired him on the spot. At farms, you don't mess around with fire. Story 24. A man was hired to manage stock at a tea store that sold lots of delicate china. The manager walked into the back on his third day and saw him throwing boxes of teacups and teapots. He was instantly fired. Story 25. I owned a construction business and we recently hired 3 new employees due to expansion. I hadn't met them yet as my business partner was the one who interviewed them and observed them on their first day and would check in on them most mornings. Along with the new hires, we promoted one of our best workers to manager to oversee them. After a few days, I noticed that we were behind schedule on the job. This wasn't all that surprising because we had the new hires, but I decided it's best to go in and check it out to make sure everything was going well. So I call up my manager and tell him to go to a different site, as we managed multiple sites each day, and that I would take over at the place with the new employees. I arrived at the site half an hour late due to traffic, and everyone was already hard at work. In fact, they were working efficiently and correctly on everything. I asked them a few questions about what they were doing and got all the right answers. I figured the delay was just the first 2 days of learning and was very pleased that everything was picked up and seemed to go well. At this point, I hadn't actually introduced myself and nobody asked who I was. So it seemed everyone just assumed that I was another worker from the company they hadn't met before. 2 hours before we were supposed to finish for the day, a guy came over and said, "Hey, just so you know, we're all going to head out now, but clock in that we worked the whole day. Our manager allows it, and the owners never notice." That is the story of how I fired 3 new hires on the first day I met them, and also how I had to fire our best worker. Story 26. About 35 minutes. I hired a guy to work for me as a quality inspector for merchandise headed to Walmart and Target. He bragged about everything he stole from his last job during training and how they paid him more than I did. Well, I'm not holding him back from all that money, so I had some big guys escort him off the property. Story 27. 3 hours into the first shift, a guy lost it serving an annoying customer in a grocery shop and threw a cabbage at her. The manager came and told him to go home because he was finished there. He wasn't surprised. I was standing next to him. It was an entertaining day. Story 28. Day 1 of training. Within the 6th hour of an 8-hour shift. Worked in an old crank handle service elevator at a private residential condominium for very wealthy people. We told him to just shut up and stare straight ahead. Don't speak unless spoken to, because old rich people are mean and don't care about you. Well, what does the new guy do? He starts a conversation right away and asks the resident, "How much money do you make?" Edit. To be more clear, it was a 1920s skyscraper in downtown.